between Lieutenant Governor Mario Cuomo, Democratic and Liberal Party candidate, and Louis Lehrman, the Republican Party candidate. This program was taped earlier today at the Sheraton Center in New York City.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome all of the viewers who are watching today's debate on WNET Channel 13. Now, I'd also like to recognize some of our guests, the two candidates for Lieutenant Governor, Democrat Al Del Bello and Republican Jim Emery. And the Right to Life candidate for Governor, Bob Bonner. The debate will follow closely the format used in the first two post-formats staged during the primaries. Each candidate will make an opening statement of 3 minutes, followed by a 1-minute rebuttal. In turn, each candidate will then be asked the same question, alternating the first shot from one candidate to another. They will each have 2 minutes to answer. If they seek to interrupt each other within the bounds of reason, or to rebut each other, I shall not stop them, but I shall do my best to ensure that by the end of the debate, each candidate shall have had the floor for roughly the same amount of time. At the end of the debate, I should ask each candidate to sum up for 2 minutes. I'd like to say how grateful we are to both candidates for being here this morning. They have both had a long, hot, and arduous summer. Sometimes they make these debates seem easy, but I know what preparation and dedication goes into them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our two candidates, our two debaters today, Lieutenant Governor Mario Cuomo and Republican Lou Lehrman. Ladies and gentlemen, we have already decided by a flip of the coin who shall open, and it is Lieutenant Governor Mario Cuomo.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity again. For more than 7.5 years, I've been part of the governmental effort that brought this state back from virtual bankruptcy in 1975. We had been pushed there by 16 years of Republican administration that made us the most heavily taxed state in the United States and that drove out of New York hundreds of thousands of jobs. Our remedy has been to reduce taxes, some $2.6 billion, to slow the growth of government to under the inflation rate, and to bring nearly 500,000 new job opportunities back to New York State. I'm grateful for the chance to talk about that record today, and the chance for my opponent to clarify some statements that he's made on important issues over the last few months. Let me enumerate as many of those statements as time will allow me in this opening. My opponent proposes in varying forms and differing degrees a series of exciting tax cuts for next year beyond the ones that we've already made, saying that the state will be able to afford them. Every economist I know says that there's going to be a budget gap, even without new tax reductions. And we have a legal obligation to close that gap. Will my opponent give us the names of some economists I've missed, perhaps? My opponent has said in the Daily News debate that he would insist on cutting the 4.25% sales tax that New York City is burdened with. because he said that's where the pain is the greatest. I didn't think state government had the power to insist on cutting a New York City sales tax. Will my opponent tell me I'm wrong? I read where my opponent proposes heavy fines and criminal penalties to control toxic dumping. But we've already adopted those provisions legislatively. Is he suggesting we do them over? He says he can cut 2 to 5% of the state purposes budget across the board without looking. That would mean that the overcrowded prison system would get approximately $20 million less. Mental institutions and programs for the homeless would get approximately $35 million less. Transportation would get $15 million less. Has he studied the budgets of those agencies sufficiently so that he can reasonably suggest these cuts? Has he measured the impact those cuts would have on lives, in pain, in dislocation, and incidentally in lost revenues? He says that he would personally scrutinize the budget of every state agency. Does my opponent realize that if he personally passed on the state budget at the rate of over $1 million an hour, it would take him over 3 years to approve the budget without ever doing anything else as governor? My opponent says that Reaganomics has not gone far enough. So far, it has cost this state approximately $2 billion, created depression-like unemployment rates, destroyed thousands of small businesses, caused more crime and drug addiction. Will he tell us today what additional cuts in federal assistance he would recommend if he were governor? I have other questions, but I'll await the answers to these before moving on. Thank you.
Nations and states are made and grow so long as they have a program for the future. I look not to the past, nor to the credit and blame of those who would take it. Mine is a program of economic renewal for this, the most beautiful of 50 states. It is economic growth, which I believe to be goal number one in New York State in the 1980s. As we have been 49th in this nation of 50 states in job growth during the 1970s, so I believe we must be number one again. And this, the most important aspect of the American dream. Ours, the life of our children, our grandchildren in the 1980s, must be a program of business building rather than business exporting, as it has been during the last decade, when 50% of all the firms which left our state went to the states next door, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Ours must be an era of hope and the possibility for change. We must rebuild our public works. We must rebuild our roads, our rails, our canals. We must begin to once more invest in the future of New York State instead of plundering the public treasury for political economic experiments which have been abject failures. Indeed, in New York City, in large parts of New York State, it could be properly said that we live with conditions which are unacceptable by absolutely every standard of faith, morality, law, common sense. We live in a state where there were 2,200 murders. We live in a city where there were 1,800 murders. We live in a city where the chief cause of death of a black man, 25 years of age and under, is murder. Whole neighborhoods have been turned into vicious killing grounds. Who, I ask, will start a business, expand a business, bring new jobs and businesses into our forlorn boroughs in the absence of our institutions of public safety? In every significant respect, our institutions of public safety must be rededicated to the protection of innocent men, women, and children who now are locked behind their doors in large parts of the outer boroughs while the criminals roam our streets free. It is not because of a sense of retribution that we desire the reestablishment of public order, public decency, and civility in our streets, our subways, our neighborhoods, our homes, it is that it is an element of the program for economic renewal. If we establish an urban enterprise zone in the Morrisania section of the Bronx, how can we bring jobs and hope, economic growth, and those who would build a home there if they cannot be assured of safety? It is for that reason that I have laid out a comprehensive reformation of our institutions of public safety, beginning with our police, extending through our courts, and being completed with our prisons. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And my vision of New York in the 1980s is one of growth and public order.
There's not a great deal Mr. Lehrman has said I would disagree with. I might suggest some responses. You say, Lou, who I asked would come to our boroughs. Rite Aid would come, and did, and made a whole lot of money. That's who would come. You ask, you say that you believe in change. So do we. We've made it. We made changes from a Republican administration that nearly devastated us for 16 years. We seek to make changes from a Republican administration in Washington now that seeks to devastate us again. You talk about rebuilding. We've begun the process of rebuilding. The most enormous contribution to our mass transportation infrastructure in the history of the United States came out of this administration. Plans for an infrastructure bond issue, which I promoted, a state prison bond issue, a transportation bond issue in 1979, together make up the most dramatic contribution to rebuilding our infrastructure in the history of the United States. You talk about hope. We believe in hope. We feel that we have spent 7.5 years making hope reasonable for the people of this state.
Mario, 60% of the Morrisania section of the Bronx has fled. 60% of Hunts Point. 30% of Harlem. Go to Harlem at 135th Street. There you will read from Bojangles, "Here I raise up the tree of life." You look for it, and there's not a twig left upon it. You speak of the infrastructure, a word we should eliminate from our vocabulary, and call it the public works and the capital stock of our state, without which our commerce cannot long endure or grow. During the period of the years where you were lieutenant governor, the capital budget for the state of New York fell from 4.5% to 3.3% of the state budget, a 30% decline in the amount that you and I, with our tax dollars, invest for the future of our children and our children's children. You speak of every economist that you know agrees with you. I know of no economist who's made a correct forecast in the last generation. All I can say, Mario, is that I hope you don't pay the bills for your children with the forecasts of the economists who have been systematically and universally incorrect.
Never in the history of this nation has an economist been more incorrect than you were when you suggested to Ronald Reagan that the way to save this nation was to give back $250 billion to the 5% richest people in the United States. When you proposed Reaganomics, as you've suggested to the state of New York and said to this nation that if Ronald Reagan listened to you, he could balance budgets in 3 years, he could bring back employment, he could solve the problems of the poor. We now face the greatest unemployment since the Great Depression, bankruptcies everywhere, a proliferation of despair. You're right about economists. That's why I'd rather rely on some of the professional politicians who have learned something about all this. Maybe we should let them play.
Yeah. No. One more, please. Okay, Mario.
Well,
You know, when Ed started that way, it got nasty, Lou.
I'm going to sit. We're not. Go ahead. We're not going to get nasty. Mario's remarks remind me of that wonderful Irish politician. I think his name was Boyle Roche, who said, "Half the lies my enemies tell about me are not true." I had my differences with President Reagan, which all know. The program I recommended, a balanced budget, a sound and honest dollar, a stable currency, and a cutback and a weeding out of unwise expenditures in the Pentagon, was a policy which in part he has followed and in part rejected. It's one of the reasons I'm back in New York. I have to ask a fundamental question, though. If Mario's entire campaign is going to be based on a campaign against Reaganomics, is there any issue at all? It seems to me if he wants to debate national economic policy, he should be running for Congress. Indeed, I would say one other thing. We're running for governor. We need solutions to the problems and pain of our people. If you're going to run against economics, I will jointly pay for a sandwich board that you can place about your shoulders when you are in Albany. And you can walk around Albany during 4 years and you can say, I'm against Reaganomics. But what, Mario, are you going to give people as solutions for their problems?
Yeah, I don't blame you for being sensitive about the federal policy. I don't blame you for trying to run away from it, Lou. But let's not play games. Let's not push everything to polar extremes that become simplistic. You don't want any part of Reaganomics, and I don't blame you. President Reagan said he would come here to campaign for you, but he hasn't been asked. I'm asking him. Come here and campaign for Lou.
Excuse me. I would to suggest,
I know you haven't been in the state long, but to suggest that we can govern the state of New York without addressing the federal policy that costs us $2 billion, that deprives us drug addiction money, that deprives us money for the homeless, that takes money out of this state, that refuses to give us money for the infrastructure, that refuses to compensate us for national failures. The drug addiction problem is a federal problem, not a domestic problem. We don't produce the cocaine. The problem of the undocumented aliens is a federal problem. It is not a local problem. The problem of welfare is a federal problem. To suggest, because you're embarrassed by this administration, that I ought not to talk about the truth won't work.
Mario. One thing. Mario, I don't want to confuse you with the facts.
But you don't have enough facts to confuse me with.
Mario, all the facts are here. Let me read you, Mario, from your own budget. In 1982, 1983, your own budget says that you are getting $325 million more from the federal government, $7.6 billion. Your 83-84 forecast shows you getting $8.144 billion. That's a $556 million increase. Your 85 budget shows a $634 million increase to $8.7 billion, and your 85-86 budget shows $9.4 billion. Each year, Mario's own budget forecast shows the federal government producing more revenues for New York State. That's why this campaign cannot be one of slogans and propaganda and negative criticism of a man in Washington. It must be laying out programs, solutions for our problems. I've laid out my program, Mario. I laid out one yesterday and 14 programs before that. What are your solutions? What beyond negative criticism have you to say to the people of New York State?
Now, you see, you had to get your programs by spending a whole lot of money on some slick researchers who did a lot of library work. We produced programs over 7 years. Some of the things you've said, you not only borrowed from our history, you misread them and distorted them. We don't need a list of term papers. Anybody can do that. Lou, we are besieged by them. Academicians send them to us all the time. Nuts send them to us all the time. Everybody has a program and a plan. The point is it doesn't work. Even Jim Begane was embarrassed by your proposal. Read today's Times when he says, look, sure we'd like the tax cuts, but we give tax cuts, but we can't reduce expenditures. You know what he's telling you, Lou? That you're dreaming. It doesn't work the way Reagan dreamt. And do you really suggest to the people of this state that when I say we're going to suffer $2 billion in cuts because of Reaganomics, are you telling these people that's not true? Would you stake your candidacy on that statement?
You're telling me it's not true by your own figures, Mario.
Are you
Your
saying?
own figures
Then I want to
say
ask
that.
you a question. I say the federal budget's being cut $2 billion thanks to Reaganomics. Do you deny that statement?
I deny the figures that you are stating, namely that we are being cut back in New York State.
In
Your
New
own
York
budgets
State.
show a $1,100,000,000 increase.
Well-
Your own budgets show you going from $7,600,000,000 to $9,400,000,000 in your own maroon forecast. Now, I know you don't like term papers, but you produced that one.
That's... Then I want to suggest something to you, Mr. Lehrman. Not only... No, I prefer Mr. Lehrman. Not
Or
only...
what you said about Ed Koch.
Not only have you misled the Republicans in Washington, now they're refusing to follow your advice, because your advice was that they had to cut back on expenditures. The program they adopted, which they call the New Federalism, starts with the proposition that they will give less money to the states. That is what they are boasting of. You're telling me now that they're boasting of a problem that I think is an absurdity and lying about their boast. Now we have them both ways, for imprudence and lack of intelligence about governmental policy and lack of sincerity. You've added a charge that I wouldn't even have thought of, and I thank you for it.
Everything was fine, Mary, except a couple heavy words. Let us talk about the federal cutbacks that I looked for. When I made my proposals, I wanted them to get rid of the B-1 bomber, the Tom Bigby Canal, the Clinch River breeder reactor, national political boondoggles, which will impoverish us. I called for a balanced budget as a condition and coterminous with our tax rate reductions. And that is the program for economic renewal which I presented for New York State yesterday. And it is that program of hope, the creation of jobs, 190,000 new jobs a year, which is the very basis, the substance of my campaign, laid out in considerable detail, the alternative to which has not yet been produced by my opponent. Mario, I have to ask you again. You can criticize, and you are good at it. What is your alternative? What future do you show New York?
Fine, let me answer you. Fine, thank you. Thank you. The future for New York State lies largely in proliferating private sector jobs. The way to do that is to reverse the Republican policy that drove them out. The Republicans indiscreetly and unintelligently raised taxes from a point where we were 22nd in the United States in terms of tax impact to first in the United States. They did that from 1959 to 1973. They drove out of this state 700,000 middle-class people, most of the manufacturing jobs. That was the so-called halcyon period of the Rockefeller years. We took over in 1975, virtually bankrupt. UDC couldn't borrow money, the HFA was out of business, and Arthur Levitt couldn't go to market. Here was the plan we contrived. Call it progressive pragmatism. We said, first of all, we have to bring back the private sector, an intelligent kind of supply side. Let's reduce taxes for them. Let's bring the income tax from 17.5% with a surcharge down eventually to 10%. Let's take care of the people in the middle class. Let's get rid of the unincorporated business tax. Let's let farmers leave their properties to their children and develop them as farms, not for development purposes. Let's change the law there. And we did. Let's assess things differently. Let's give larger homestead exemptions. Let's give larger credits for people who want to take deductions. Let's give a tuition deduction for people who have children in college. Let's have a PASS program. Let's have $2.6 billion in tax cuts. And then let's do this. Let's teach the Republicans a lesson. They're all slogan. They're all language. They talk about reducing the cost of government. Let's show them how to do it. And so we took the state purposes budget and we kept it at a growth rate of under the inflation rate for 7 years. And then we said, let's prove to them that it works. And we brought back 500,000 jobs in the last 4 years. What's my program? Continue tax reduction, high technology, an infrastructure bond issue, new modes of vocational education, a continuing signal to the business community that what we've done for you for all these years, we're going to continue to do for you. We're going to break double-digit taxation for income tax and businesses, but we're going to do it intelligently and discreetly, not recklessly, not the way Ronald Reagan promised to do it. We're not going to drive people out of this state. And let me add something. The balanced budget is legally required. The miracle of the last 7.5 years is not that we did all the things you Republicans asked us to do and did them better than you ever did them. The miracle was that we did it at the same time that we helped people in wheelchairs, at the same time that we had more money for people who were starving to death, at the same time that the mental institutions were beefed up to be receiving more money than ever before in the history of this state. We did it all. We proved fiscal austerity and social compassion can live side by side in a world of chivalry. And my program is to continue. Thank you.
Mr. Lehrman, tentatively, I don't want to interrupt, but tentatively, we were going to ask a question about jobs. Why don't you take the next 3 minutes to answer?
Surely. Your question, sir.
Jobs.
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 That wasn't a very imaginative question, Rob.
Well, if you want me to put it formally, I'll ask
No,
you.
I get your point, Roger. Yes. Mario's thoughts, sincere, an echo of the past. It wasn't President Reagan who drove 700,000 people out of the state of New York during the 1970s. That all occurred under the Kerry-Cuomo administration. It wasn't. This was a unique loss of population. It wasn't President Reagan who drove 825,000 people from the state of New York between 1975 and 1981, according to the Bureau of the Census. Net out-migration. It wasn't President Reagan who drove from our state 75% of them between the ages of 22 and 44. It wasn't President Reagan who made of New York State an economic backwater during the 1970s, the late 1970s, and the last few years, when we were 49th in job growth in 50 states. It wasn't President Reagan who gave us New York State at $1,495 in local and state taxes per capita. It is true, these trends began before Governor Kerry, and I have given Governor Kerry the credit when it is certainly due. I see no objective in dwelling on the past facts, except to say that New York State is an economic backwater, except to say that New York State has to be turned in an entirely new direction, and that is the goal of economic growth. Under the Kerry administration, we have barely reached the level of employment in the private sector that we had in 1973, some record. I have to ask, how are we going to make New York State grow as fast as the nation? Had we grown at the average rate of job growth in the nation in the 1970s, we would have created 190,000 jobs, 193,000 jobs each year. We created only 42,000 jobs per year. Even in the recovery period after 1976, from the trough of the recession. We have lagged behind the nation for a simple reason. New York State is no longer competitive. It is competitive for the lack of sensible tax policies, and they have been engineered in Albany. Let us consider the tax policies under Governor Kerry and Lieutenant Governor Cuomo. It was Lieutenant Governor Cuomo who recommended a 10% surcharge on all incomes in order to pay for transit. It was Lieutenant Governor Cuomo who endorsed the 25% increase in the sales tax proposed by Governor Kerry. It was Lieutenant Governor Cuomo who proposed a 20% increase in welfare payments in a state where welfare payments are already 78% above the national average. Now, is this the correct allocation of resources? I say no. And that is why yesterday I laid out a comprehensive plan, a program for economic renewal to make New York State competitive. And the technique by which we do that is to make our tax system fair. Not only to make our tax system fair, but to make it fair and competitive with our neighboring states. The goal of this is to keep our children and our grandchildren here, to build businesses here, to generate the capital, the savings with which to invest in new jobs, especially in our small business community, which in fact is the source of 80% of new job creation in the United States. That is a realistic program for economic growth. My opponent can only hearken to the past.
Oh, no, I can do better than that. You see, Lou, you believe that if you say it over and over and over again, you can make it become true. There are whole civilizations that succeeded for a while that way. You can keep saying that I'm arguing exclusively against Reaganomics. I'm not. I'm arguing against your plans. You can say we have no plans for the future. We have very many specific ones. I'll give you, well, that's going to be, well, I thought you had seen them already, but we'll run through some of them for you. Now, let me correct the record, Lou, please, before this campaign goes any further. I've already had to send to the Board of Elections to correct a piece of literature you sent, which is so outrageously inaccurate and demagogic that it surprised me, because you give all appearances of high style, except when your name is not, attached to the piece. You've already had to pull television commercials off the air. Now, your statements about the welfare increase are outrageous. The welfare increase was the first in over 6 years.
Did you propose a 20% increase, Mario?
Excuse me.
Didn't you?
Excuse me, Lou. May I finish? Thank you. The welfare increase was the first in over 6 years. It was supported, promoted, proposed by every enlightened Republican in the state and adopted by the Republican majority in the Senate. We have not suggested, and if you took a poll that tells you people don't like poor people anymore, and maybe you ought to run against welfare and run against poor people, I'm telling you wrong. You're wrong, because this state is more intelligent and more sensitive than that, and you're making a mistake. Now let me give you just a few suggestions, Lou, that you have your researchers look up and see if you agree with me on these notions for the future. For the future. An investment council to seek a way to aggressively use the pension funds. You know about that, Lou. You remember me on this platform talking about abolishing the MTA. You know about me arguing that subway cars ought to be built here with the use of pension funds. You know it because you borrowed the idea and you're using it now. An investment council to figure out how to use the pension funds more aggressively. RITEC, a proliferation of groups like those we put together in Rensselaer County. GE, IBM, Kodak, together with Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the use of government monies through the UDC, learning from Japan and West Germany how to interpolate, not get in the way of business, not regulate them, not go into business, but how to accommodate them with a loan. I started that kind of thinking at RITEC on Long Island. We're doing it at RPI in Rensselaer County. We ought to generate that kind of activity all over the state. An infrastructure bond issue, which we badly need next year. I've already checked that out with the controllers people. Icon Erie, which is a proposal that I'm interested in pursuing. So is Brendan Burns, so is Hugh Carey, so is Ed Koch, so is Syracuse University, so is Pace, so is Belgium, so are a lot of intelligent people talking about the next generation, which we have to look to as well. Could produce 60,000 jobs, could give us a place for toxic waste, could give us a place for coal-burning plants with the prevailing winds carrying the noxious part of it out to sea. An export bank, a fishing industry, which we've never had before. Port Authority building buses. We talked about it 3 years ago. They're finally going to do it. Regional markets. Wait a minute. Regional, you want to hear some ideas for the future, Lou? I thought you were paying more attention. A rural development corporation for regional markets on Long Island and upstate. I can go on, Lou. And these are ideas I didn't purchase this year. I'm not reading them out of a 3-ring binder. These are ideas that we've learned in 7.5 years.
Lou, would you like to rebut that briefly for 2 minutes, and then I think we'll move you on to another subject.
We don't have to go on for several minutes. Just to remark, more bureaucratic agencies to be engineered by my opponent.
Excuse me.
No, let me. You had 10 minutes, Mario. Give me one.
It just seemed like 10 minutes for you, Lou.
I measured it. You're right, it was 7.5 minutes, Mario. Mario proposes to take the pension funds, the retirement plans of our senior citizens, and speculate with them. There are laws on this. Pension funds are held by fiduciaries for the retirement of senior citizens. What would you do, Mario, if they invested the way the government invests most of its money, by pouring it down a hole if the pension fund monies were lost? Would you pay it back to them? Mario, that shows how fuzzy-headed your thinking is. There are laws against speculating with pension fund money. No, no. I'm just getting ready, Lucas. What I have laid out is a program whereby all New Yorkers from all walks of life will have increased incentives to work and to save and to invest. That's the difference between me and my opponent. He thinks government should provide for people by putting together bureaucratic agencies and experimenting with their families, experimenting with their businesses, experimenting with their neighborhoods, experimenting with the powers of government to do good. Now, that is sincere and decent. We've had a generation of that type of activity in Washington and Albany. It brought our nation to its knees with 21.5% interest rates under your very own Jimmy Carter, for whom you were the campaign manager, and it brought the state of New York to its knees. There's a fundamental difference between me and my opponent. I am not running for governor because I, like Mario, believe I can solve all the problems of New Yorkers. I'm running for governor because I believe the people of New York can solve their problems if we will only release their energies and take the oppressive burden of the government off.
That's what I would call talk show conservatism, you know. It's great. You know, it's a lot of one-line. Now, let's get back to the truth. Because, Lou, I know they program you. You paid a lot of money for this, you know, to read the polls, say these are the cliches to use, and if you keep saying them, they'll work. Now, let me explain something to you, Lou. Get yourself a good attorney, okay?
Hey,
we went through this with Mayor Koch. I have public employee unions, some of them supporting me. I have other unions supporting me as well. They'll be very useful. You know why, Lou? I'm going to be able to do something for this state that we haven't been able to do for a long time. I have a lot of business people supporting me. I have the business council that agrees with me and not with you about your tax plan and a lot of other things. I'm going to be able to put the business council and the unions together at a table. I'm going to be able to talk to them about using pension funds legally. Of course it's legal. Of course you're wrong. We just signed a bill to give us the discretionary use of 5%. It's called the basket bill. It's $1.5 billion. Of course it can be used. And of course it doesn't affect the pensioners. Now let me get something else clear. Let me get something else clear because I'm going to make the most of this. I can't match you in 30-second commercials. This is my shot today. You know, it is not true. It is not true. It is not true that I want to solve problems by throwing money at them. It is not true that I want government to go into business. It is not true that the Rural Development Corporation is another bureaucratic monster.
What is it, Dan? What is it?
Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, Lou, maybe they didn't have one in Pennsylvania, but we had an Urban Development Corporation. I'll tell you what it is, Lou. I'll tell you what it is. What it is a vehicle for financing, like the Urban Development Corporation. Oh, Lou, don't get excited. Listen, Lou, be patient. Be patient. We're going to have a lot of debates, Lou. Be patient. Okay.
What has it done, Mario? What has it done?
Excuse me, Lou. You have a different set of rules where you come from, Lou. We're supposed to finish, you know? Okay, let me finish. We were a state that began the process of deregulation. I want to get clear who we are and who they are. The administration that preceded us, Lou, was a Republican administration. It overregulated. It drove business out. It overtaxed them. It desiccated their interest in this state. We went in just the other direction. And incidentally, it wasn't just Democrats. It wasn't just Kerry. It was Stanley Steingut and Stanley Fink, two Democrats in the Assembly. It was Warren Anderson, a Republican, who helped save the city of New York and helped save Buffalo and helped save Yonkers. How did they do it? By throwing money at problems? No, Lou. You see, let's talk common sense and facts. What we did was we observed that the taxes were too high and we reduced them. We knew that we were overregulating and we deregulated. We created the Urban Development Corporation to help people to go back into business, to build the Syracuse Convention Center, to build a convention center in New York City, to help with Battery Park, to put people back to work, to get the wheels of industry moving again, and it's happened. And Lou, you're wrong again when you say that we are somehow shriveling. We have an enormous future. Our per capita income growth is above the rest of the nation. Our unemployment rate is beneath the national average. We have 27 of the most progressive and hardest-hitting companies right here in New York City. Lou, they're not going away. They're coming back. and they're coming to us the way Rite Aid did. And I'll say something for you, Lou. I appreciate and applaud what you did. What you did was to prove this is a state where if you're intelligent and you work hard, you can make a killing. And you're not unique. A lot of people can do it. I'll answer that one. Thank you. That is the issue. That is the issue. Which candidate has a proven record for actually creating real jobs for New Yorkers who want work? Thank you very much, Mario, for putting the issue. And I think that, in fact, this campaign is the resolution of a single issue. Instead of wearing a billboard or sandwich board over your back saying this is my latest press release against Reaganomics, answer the question, how are we going to produce new jobs? This is the way I believe New York State can create new jobs. By projects not like a new bureaucratic agency, which Mario presided over low these last 4 years, but the Bedford-Stuyvesant project, which I have visited 3 times. A project that was engineered by Senator Jacob Javits and Robert Kennedy in the private sector. In the private sector. The Bed-Stuy project was a project which brought the private sector into the development of a shopping center. This Bed-Stuy restoration project is the kind of project which I believe the private sector can do much better than the public sector. Second of all, Mario speaks about his backing. He talks about the public unions, whom he has the support of. He speaks also of some other elite members of the leadership around New York. Now, Mario, I know that the public union bosses have been behind your campaign. Your campaign finances, in fact, are largely accounted for by the leadership of public union bosses. Now, do we really want Victor Gottbaum to break the back of the economy of the state of New York? It was he, in fact, and the likes of him, that brought the city of New York to its knees in 1975. Now, wait a minute. This is nothing personal. Victor Gottbaum is a decent man. But the point is, it is the public union bosses, not the civil servants, not their employees, it's the public union bosses who, in fact, made Mario's campaign go in the primary. And these are the people to whom he's beholden. The very same people who produced the fiscal crisis which Governor Carey came in to solve. And I agree with you, Mario, even though you were only Secretary of State then, he did solve that fiscal crisis. And that is another issue in this campaign. Do we want to turn over the state government of New York to the same people who broke the back of the city in 1974 and 5?
You know, Lou, you have revealed one of the most depressing vulnerabilities for new political people. You have given way to the temptation to scapegoat. You really have. And I think it's unfortunate. What you just said about Victor Gottbaum, who represents people who make $12, $13, $15, $17,000 a year, you know, who helped save this city of New York that had been bankrupted by a whole series of people. Let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. You know, I know what the polls say, Lou. I know that the polls say if you want to win, beat up on the union people. Said it in 1977 and they did it. I know what your polls say, Lou. I can tell from what you say every day on the streets that you're reading a poll. You'll never say anything that poll doesn't say is popular, but you're wrong and it's irresponsible. And I'll suggest this to you. Victor Gottbaum is supporting me, and I'm proud of his support. I want to help those people who make $12,000, $15,000, $17,000, the black faces, the brown faces, the white faces, the people who make this city work. They're my people, Lou. And let me tell you something. I want to tell you something. You know, you've got this neat debaters trick, Lou. They taught you. They wrote it out. Somebody wrote it out on a card. It says, use the Gottbaum name. He supports Cuomo. Say that the city will be turned over to Gottbaum. Richard Nixon supports you. Are we going to turn over the state to Richard Nixon?
Mario, it was you who has made President Reagan our president a scapegoat. Wait a minute. It was you who made up Governor Rockefeller, elected 4 times, Mario. You have yet to win your general election. He elected...
That will come, Lou.
Yes. It was you who made up Governor Rockefeller and President Reagan. Even though you may disagree with them, they are distinguished citizens, and they are public servants. You made them the scapegoats. But they did not crush New York State. They did not crush the city of New York. You brought up the question of your public union leadership support, not I, and I say that you are beholden to them in a way that the state of New York has to be wary of. I'm only laying out the facts. Now, as for polls, my opponent, a sincere man, has been campaigning on a single issue from the very beginning. He even campaigned against Ed Koch on Reaganomics alone. Reaganomics is bad for New York, he says. Now, I ask you, you got that information from your poll by Pat Cadell, and you know that to run in New York State against Reaganomics is in fact what your polls tell you. Mario, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. This is, I think, self-righteous of you because every one of your issues you take from the polls, especially those which make you look good in that wing of the party from which you had to win your primary.
That, like the death penalty, Lou. Like the death penalty. Oh, let me explain something, Lou. Let me explain something to you, Lou. I was against Reaganomics when no one else was in this state. I was against Reaganomics in 1980, Lou. I warned them what it would do to this state. I warned them what it would do to the nation. I was for what I'm saying now when the poll said it was popular, when the poll said it was unpopular. One of the reasons I haven't won is, number one, I wasn't too good at politics for a few years. I'm still not the best at it. Number two, it's, Lou, it's a relative thing, Lou. The, number two,
We'll see on
Number two, Lou, I think if you check my history, you'll see that I haven't taken the positions, and I'm not boasting of this, I haven't taken the positions that the polls thought were popular because my whole view of government and governmental philosophy is that we mustn't lead that way, Lou. We mustn't tell the people what they think they want to hear, because if we did that, Lou, in 1920, they would have taken a poll. And they would have said, should the people come from where your people came from? Should the people come from Italy? Should the people come from Poland and the Mediterranean, people who have no jobs and have no education and want nothing more than to take work here and call it opportunity? Should we let them in? You know what that poll would have said, Lou? It would have said 89-11, don't let them in. That's why you can't live by polls, Lou. You've got to show a little leadership. And now let me tell you something else about who's beholden to whom. I am not beholden to anybody, and everybody knows that. That's... Now, but if you want to... I wasn't beholden to a president who I supported because I disagreed with him, a governor I worked with who I respectfully disagreed with from time to time, political bosses, people with money, people without money. I'm not beholden to anybody but my own conscience. And I'll tell you this, if you're going to assume that you are beholden to those people whom you support and who support you, then the following is true. I am beholden to 3 million working people in this city, people who work for and state. Who are you beholden to, Lou? The people who gave you money?
Mario, let me answer. 9,000 people all over the state of New York, from every walk of life, have invested in my campaign. 7,000 people have invested between $2 and $100 in my campaign. I have more contributors between $2 and $100 from the average person, the average taxpayer, the average working man and woman from the state of New York than my opponent, Mayor Koch, and all the other candidates in this campaign put together. Now, that is the source of my support. Taxpayers, farmers, middle-income people. Listen to the facts now. Listen to the facts. These people have invested over $2.5 million in my campaign, more than my opponent has raised, who has raised his funds largely from special interest groups, as he pointed out, from public union bosses. Now, my opponent also says that he has been against Reaganomics, that he has been against economic growth and renewal as set forth by our president since 1980. Let me read you a quote of his. I and some others see the overwhelming sentiment in Congress and the nation as is that this new approach is worth a try. That Mario Cuomo said in January '81. Now, I am pulling for my president. All Americans are pulling for their president to be successful. All Republicans, all Democrats want him to be successful. All of us know that he has made mistakes and that Mario and I will make mistakes. But to base your campaign on a single issue drawn from the polls that Reaganomics may be unpopular with Democrats in New York seems to me to try the patience of the voters. What is important in this campaign is who is laying out the solutions to our problems? Who has laid out a program for economic renewal in the state of New York in the future? And in that regard, Mario has yet to lay out a single alternative other than to look to the past. Is there a closing? Is there a closing?
Closer, is it?
Yes. Mario goes first with that.
I go first again?
Yeah.
First of all, let me take the opportunity, Lou, to say how much fun it is to share a platform with you. I know we're going to be doing it some more, and after all the interruptions and all the rhetoric, please keep in mind my enormous respect for you personally, and I'm sure that's going to continue for the rest of the campaign. And I think, frankly, it's a good thing that people would even try entering this maelstrom we call a political system, and I applaud you for having put your foot in the water. I've spent more than 7.5 years doing all the things a governor has to know how to do. I've worked on 7 state budgets. I've reduced costs and improved productivity in my own agencies. I've proven in actual experience that you can do more with less in state government. For 25 years, I've worked in the criminal justice system and with the Court of Appeals, which the next governor will reconstitute with 5 appointments. I know the people of the state who live in all about thousands of counties and villages and towns and cities. I know their problems. I know what we've done right that saved the city of New York and saved Buffalo and saved Yonkers, that brought back nearly 500,000 jobs. And I know what we didn't do right. And I know what needs to be done and how to do it. I've been specific about my alternatives, not just in this campaign, but for many years. I have more years of experience in state government than my opponent has years in the state. Our agendas are different. My program of jobs and justice is one that was created out of a real experience long before I chose to run for governor. It is realistic, it is honest, it is achievable. His is a series of term papers, expensive but unenlightening, in some places dramatically naive, developed as a rationalization for a candidacy that respectfully and frankly is nearly implausible. It's a candidacy without a history in this state, without governmental experience in this state. Indeed, and again respectfully, even a candidacy without a proven commitment to the people of this state. It's a candidacy distinguished only by the enormous financial resources that made it possible. And there's another difference. Over the last 7.5 years, we've proven that government can be fiscally responsible, reducing taxes, attracting businesses, controlling costs, while at the same time meeting the social needs of our middle class and poor. Another important point of difference between us. Only one of many, but an important one. My Republican opponent espouses a philosophy that was called the inspiration for the present failed Republican national economic policy. Let me use his words. Quote, "The Reagan administration is headed in the right direction. All the aspects of the Reagan economic program are necessary, but I do not believe they are sufficient. The Reagan administration has not gone far enough. With 1 out of 10 people out of work, bankruptcies proliferating, deficits growing, one must shudder at how much further down my opponent would take this state. How many more unemployed? How many more small businesses destroyed? How much more crime before we return to reasonableness? My position is that the Republican economic plan, which has already wreaked havoc with this nation and has impacted the state with disproportionate unfairness, needs to be corrected, not expanded, at the expense of middle-class people in New York and those who would beg to be middle class, but are denied the opportunity. In the end, this election is a contest between good ideas that are proven sound and contrived ideas that sound good. In the end, this election is a contest between experience that money can't buy and all the exposure that money can buy. It raises the question of whether leadership of the greatest state in the nation must be earned or can be bought. Thank you.
Very nice, Mario. work.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
For me too, Mario, it's a great pleasure to appear here with you. I had a choice. It was between going to a Playboy interview or coming to the debate. I chose the debate. This is the great divide in New York politics. The voters of New York have not had so clear a choice in a generation. The choice is between a distinguished professional politician and an independent businessman who represents the taxpayers of the state of New York. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. In Lincoln's words, we must think about the future and how it is that we can redirect the energies of our people, how it is that we can grow again in New York, how it is that this state, the most beautiful of the 50 states, can be made once again preeminent. My vision of New York is not unlike that of the Good Shepherd. You know, the Good Shepherd leaves no one behind, but neither does he hold anyone back. The idea is that we must provide incentives with which our people can rebuild this economy and create the businesses and the new enterprises without which there shall be no future in New York. If I do not keep in step with others, it is sometimes perhaps because I march to a different drumbeat. The drumbeat which I hear is the drumbeat of the future, and not the tinkling cymbals of the failures of the past. It is for that reason that I have sought to make this campaign a campaign of ideas, a campaign about solutions to the problems which pain New Yorkers, those who languish without the hope of public safety in our neighborhoods, those senior citizens who are now locked up behind their doors while violent criminals roam free. It's been a campaign about how to resolve these issues of public policy. And it is for that reason that I have laid out a program not only for economic renewal, but restoring our neighborhoods proudly to conditions of public order, which we knew and our parents knew, and for which our immigrant forebears came here in the first place. I say that the first purpose of government in a free society is to establish public order, uphold decency and civility, and to protect our neighborhoods and our innocent people. And in that specific respect, with all of the tinkering that has gone on before us, our government has failed us, our families, our children, our wives. It is for that reason that I believe we must rededicate our government in the future to two goals. One, making of New York State the most prosperous economy of the 50 states. And two, providing for those of our citizens who live here the prospect of security, peace, and retirement in dignity. Thank you very much.